שלום לכולם, ברוכים הבאים לפריזמה. אנחנו ככה ממש מתחילים בדיוק בזמן. אז תודה רבה לכל האורחים שהצטרפו. הצטרפתם לכנס השקת תוכניות אסטרטגית למידה דיגיטלית של 18 מכללות, אז אנחנו ביום של חגיגה. התחלנו כבר ב-2, ועכשיו פתחנו את זה לכל מי שרוצה ככה לשמוע את האורח המקסים והחשוב שמצטרף אלינו היום. אבל רק להגיד לכם בדקה הראשונה שיש פה יום חשוב מאוד מבחינת אירוע מדהים ומרגש של בעצם בנייה של אסטרטגית למידה דיגיטלית ב-18 מכללות של פריזמה. מי שלא שמע על פריזמה, תוכנית שאפתנית ואף נועזת, שלה שותפים משרד החינוך, המנהל לעובדי הוראה, יחד עם ישראל דיגיטלית, מכון מופת בחברת מתודיקה, ובמסגרת החגיגה הזו אנחנו מארחים את דוקטור ג'סטין רייך מאוניברסיטת MIT. תכף נציג אותו ונעבור לאנגלית. So, hi everyone and welcome Justin. A minute before we start, just to let you know that you can have subtitles in Hebrew, אולי אני גם אגיד את זה בעברית, תרגום סימולטני באמצעות כתוביות בסרגל התחתון של הזום. יש כפתור שנקרא Closed Caption, CC, לוחצים עליו, בוחרים באפשרות של Show Subtitles, אפשר גם לשחק עם ההגדרות אם אתם רוצים את הכתוביות על המסך או במהלך הצ'אט. זהו, חוזרים לאנגלית. So, we are honored here in Prisma to host Justin Reich as part of an important day in the educational colleges in Israel. Welcome, Justin, to our celebration. Justin Reich is an educational researcher interested in the future of learning in a networked world. He is the director of the MIT Teaching System Lab, which aspires to design, implement, and research the future of teacher learning. He is also the author of a new book called Failure to Disrupt, Why Technology Alone Can't Transform Education, published by Harvard University Press. It's not an easy book to find these days, but we managed to buy 18 copies that were already delivered, so the Prisma members who have the book can show them, and 40 more books on their way, so that we can distribute them to more members of Prisma. Justin is also the host of 5 MOOCs, 5 open online courses on edX, including one which is called Launching Innovation in Schools. So just by repeating these 3 titles regarding Justin, the future of teacher learning, technology alone can't transform education, launching innovation in schools, you can understand how privileged we are to have him with us. Please know this is a short session, 30 minutes, but we will hopefully leave some time for questions. So you're also invited to write questions in the chat during the session. So thank you so much, Justin, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Terrific. Well, it's really wonderful to be able to join you all. I'm very excited about your initiative. And I want to try to share 3 things with you that might be helpful in your journey on this work. The first is a little bit about our work at the Teaching Systems Lab. The second is a little bit about some of the obstacles that I anticipate that you'll encounter in your work. And the third is maybe some guidelines about how you can overcome those obstacles. So I want to very much thank Gideon and Sharon for inviting me. And as Gideon said, I run a lab at MIT called the Teaching Systems Lab, where we aspire to design, implement, and research the future of teacher learning. All around the world, people want to see more ambitious teaching in K-12 classrooms. They want to see less recitation, more active, student-centered learning. And the only way we'll get there is the kind of work that you're doing to increase the quantity and quality of learning opportunities that educators get across their lifetimes. In our lab, we're particularly interested in 2 approaches to expanding those learning opportunities. One is online and blended learning. So we create a series of freely available, open source, open online courses. And we try to do this work in domains in which we think people would think, yeah, it's pretty hard to teach teachers this stuff online. So we do work in change leadership. We do work in anti-racist equity teaching practices. We do work in design thinking. And our research is trying to figure out, what are models that we can develop that help teachers build new capacity, through largely asynchronous online means, in ways that are blended with their local school context. Because if we can make really great online learning for teachers, then there's more opportunities for them to pursue that learning with their busy, complex schedules and lives. To me, the exciting thing about trying to do some of that work in the pre-service context is if people leave colleges of education well practiced in online learning, then they're going to be better able to take advantage of those opportunities moving forward in their careers. The second thing that we work on are what we call teacher practice spaces. When we look at teacher learning opportunities, we see that when teachers learn, they listen to people talk about teaching and they talk with each other about teaching, but they very rarely do teaching. And so we want to try to create new digital opportunities for people to be able to rehearse for and reflect on important decisions in teaching. Some of the resources that we have available that you all can take advantage of right now, we have on the MIT Open Learning Library, which is kind of like our open courseware for massive open online courses. We have a whole series of courses that we've now created. There's one more that's going to be up there soon called Sorting Truth from Fiction, about civic online reasoning that I taught with Sam Weinberg from Stanford. As we go along, I'll tell you more about the different kinds of components of these courses, but these are some of the topics that we're working on. And it'll be really excited for us to partner with any of you all to figure out how these can be blended or hybridized or integrated in your programs in various ways. Because they're all openly licensed, there are no restrictions on translating them and things like that. There's all kinds of ways for you to reuse and remix them. We're inspired quite a bit by the work of Pam Grossman, who's now the Dean of the College of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, and her work on the sort of urgency of creating more practice-based learning opportunities for teachers. She describes a sort of three-part cycle of how people in the helping professions like teaching and nursing and social work learn. There are representations of practice. You see videos, you look at documents of lesson plans, you observe what the professional work looks like. Decomposition, you break down that professional work and you learn what specific components of it are. That was a cold call. That was a formative assessment moment. That was using presence to manage behavioral disruption in the classroom. Getting down to the sort of fine-grained work of like, here's how you do these things. Here's the theory behind them. Here are competing ideas about how these approaches work. And then the piece that the teaching profession, certainly in the United States, but I think this is common around the world, has some of the most opportunity to grow in is around approximation. Once you develop some sense of what a technique is, how do we get you to rehearse for and reflect on that technique before you have to do it with 27 kids in front of you who have to learn how to factor polynomials that day? So there are a bunch of existing approaches to approximation and practice. You probably use some of them in your programs. One of the ones which I think is much more substantial in Israel, is smaller in the United States, is sort of in-person clinical simulations with actors. So you go into a room, there's a trained actor, you practice some circumstance. Lots of programs around the world use kind of teaching rehearsals. So I'd say, Sharon, you be the teacher and do a 10-minute mini lesson, and we'll all have cards that say what kinds of students we are and what we're supposed to do during class, and then you do your mini lesson. There are new tools like Mersion. I don't know how many of your programs have experimented with this. It's kind of a digital puppetry software. There's an actor with an Xbox controller who controls 5 student avatars and can make them raise their hands or get bored and put their heads on their desk. Uses voice modulators, so one person is talking, but it sounds like 5 different kids. These are all terrific approaches to practice. One of the ways that we sort of map that space is we say, how many of these opportunities for practice try to get
teachers to do the whole work, the whole complex assemblage of teaching, versus how many of them give opportunities to practice sort of more individual skill components? And then how many of them are digital versus how many of them are analog? We observe that most of the opportunities for practice are kind of clustered on the right side. If we were athletes, we might say that we give our teachers some opportunities for scrimmages. And scrimmages are great. It's great to have that sort of realistic sense of practicing the whole thing. The challenge is that there's good research from complex learning and cognitive science, which suggests that it's very difficult for novices to get better at individual components while practicing a whole complex task. The other thing is a lot of these opportunities for practice are quite logistically complicated and time consuming. So mock teaching is great. Typically in a typical methods class, every pre-service teacher can do one mock teaching experience once or twice or something like that, and it takes up a third of the semester. So they're great, but they're big. We've been in our lab interested in work that takes place in this sort of upper left-hand corner. What would it look like to create practice spaces that are smaller, that are digital, that can be done asynchronously, that you could be done multiple times? To go back to the athlete analogy, what would it look like to create practice spaces that were more like drills? Opportunities for low stakes practice, rehearsal, and reflection that you could do asynchronously over and over again. So let me tell you a little bit about sort of how we blend these two ideas of online learning and digital practice spaces together. We have a course that's running right now on edX called Becoming a More Equitable Educator, Mindsets and Practices. It's about anti-racist equity teaching practices. We teach it with Rich Milner from Vanderbilt University, who in the United States is one of the leading thinkers on race and education and justice in the United States. The course has kind of an introductory unit and then a series of 4 main units. And the content of the course is trying to help people see that there are a series of educator mindsets that are out of balance in schools. To some extent, we need some sense of equality, what's fair to everyone, and some sense of equity, what each individual student needs. But we spend way too much time in schools focused on equality rather than equity. Sometimes it's useful to think about students' deficits, but we don't spend nearly enough time thinking about and looking at the work of schooling through the lens of their assets. We are all too often avoidant of issues of difference, and in US schools, racism, when we need to be aware and engaged with those issues. We're all too often context neutral in our approach, thinking of the school and the classroom as divorced from the rest of the society, when we should really be thinking about all the assets that communities can bring to this work. So that's the kind of content of the course. And then the way we teach it is through a series of components. There are a series of expert lectures. So if you go into the course, you'll get presentations from Rich Milner and I about these ideas and about these frameworks. One of the things that we can do with online education in powerful ways is that we can take you as a learner to places where this work is happening. So we have these voices in the field documentaries where we take learners into schools that are wrestling with deficit thinking versus asset framing, looking at the teaching practices there, figuring out how students are reacting. One of the most powerful things we can do in online learning is take learners to different places where this work is happening. And then we use our digital practice spaces to have people engage in digital clinical simulations. I'm sorry, this picture is a little fuzzy. This is a new slide we put together and it doesn't seem to be rendering very well. But the number 3 there is one of our digital practice spaces where through text and images and audio, we immerse you in some challenging moment of classroom teaching. And then there's either a text box or a microphone icon that pops up at various points throughout the simulation where you have to say, what would you say to this student? So in this scenario, Coach Wright, you play the role of an instructional coach, which is supporting a teacher, and the teacher is bringing a sort of deficit lens to a lot of her interactions with her students. And you have to think about, how would you encourage her? How would you give her specific strategies about bringing more of an asset lens to that work? The simulations can be done on students' mobile phones. They can be done asynchronously anytime. For instructors who facilitate this work, it's possible to get sort of all the data that's being generated by people's participation, who does them, when. We get sort of displays of, here are all the different answers that participants in a group had to this particular prompt or this particular challenge. When students do audio recording, they're automatically transliterated, transcribed, so that people can go back and read what they said in addition to listening to them. So there's one of those practice spaces kind of embedded in each unit. And then there's a debrief of each of those practice spaces. When we do this work in in-person classrooms, we get people together and have them reflect on all of the different things they saw in the practice spaces and all of the different ways that they responded. But also for the online course, we actually filmed groups of educators doing those debriefs and had people watch them. And we were actually shockingly surprised. We sort of thought, I don't know how well this debrief thing is going to work when people just watch it rather than participate. And we've been really surprised the degree to which being able to observe other teachers' process and experience has been very powerful for our online learners. And then the final component of each unit in the course is to get people to leave the online course, go back into their classrooms, and to try some of the strategies that we've been teaching them around equity teaching practices. So we don't view our online courses as one where you study something for 8 weeks and then you're like equity teaching certified and you can go do this stuff. Rather, we want you to see your online learning experience as sort of seamlessly blended with your classroom learning experience. You come online, you learn some stuff, you get some new ideas, you go back into your classrooms, you implement them. Ideally, actually, you do these learning experiences not just by yourself, but in a learning circle with a group of other educators who are pursuing this same experience with you at the same time. So you can discuss, you can reflect on how these ideas might be implemented in your own context. All of the stuff that we build, again, is openly sourced and open licensed. So all the scenarios are freely available for many of our practice spaces, including these Teacher Moments digital clinical simulations. We have an authoring tool, so people can rewrite the scenarios in their own context. There's a group of neuroscience educators in hospitals who have taken becoming a more equitable educator, sort of stripped out all of the K-12 based practice spaces and added 4 hospital based scenarios to what they're doing. And we're in the midst of supporting them in that work. So for folks who are interested in some of these ideas, we'd certainly be excited to continue talking about how we can collaborate. Hopefully what that does is just give you some sense of the areas in which we're trying to innovate in online and blended teacher learning practice and inspire you a bit as you pursue your own efforts. And I can make sure that Gideon and Sharon can follow up with you with links that we have to all these different kinds of things and resources. So you will have challenges as you do this work. For the last 2 decades, education technology entrepreneurs have promised that we're on the cusp of a dramatic transformation in teaching and learning. And to a large extent, that hasn't happened. As you read the book, you'll find that the main thing that I argue, it's not that technology can't be helpful. It's that technology is not disruptive in education. Technology is not sweeping. The places that make the most progress in thoughtfully integrating new technologies take a kind of incremental, ongoing, shoulder to the wheel sort of approach. And it's an approach that I'm trying to lionize in the book. It may not be as sort of sexy or satisfying as we're on the cusp of dramatic transformation, but it has the virtue of being true and aligned with the historical evidence, even if it means there's a lot of work ahead. One of the things that I do in the book is try to describe just 4 really common dilemmas that show up over and over again, when people try new technology initiatives in schools and higher education institutions. Let me just briefly mention a couple of them. One is that a really common finding from the history of education technology is that when teachers get access to new technologies, they use them to extend existing practices. What you should expect when you ask your faculty to adopt new tools is that it's going to be a developmental process. And the first thing that they're going to want to do is exactly what they were doing before. If you want enormously powerful global evidence of this, travel around the world and visit the remote learning classrooms that have sprung up in the wake of the pandemic. And in almost all of them, you'll see teachers using two technologies, learning management systems and video conferencing, to sort of replicate as closely as possible the classroom experiences they had before, even though there's all kinds of different and new things we might be able to do with technologies. Where people start is where they're most comfortable in what they were doing before. And then I think you'll probably have less concerns with this in your work, but perhaps substantial concerns in the downstream work of changing schools, is that where there is beneficial and innovative new practice with education technology, it tends to disproportionately benefit the affluent. One of the ways that this conservatism emerges in schools is what I call the curse of the familiar, which is that if you integrate technologies that look very familiar to teachers and learners, if you digitize existing practices, adoption is relatively straightforward, but it actually tends not to change the practice of schools very much. I mean, if you're just digitizing what you're already doing, it's not that much likely to be better than what they were doing before. By contrast, if you bring in new digital tools that ask people to do practice in really new and different kinds of ways, those innovations often get rejected. Sort of, you know, the immune system of schools pushes them away because it's really hard to bring new and innovative things into schools. The way through the curse of the familiar oftentimes is to develop technologies and programs which start by looking familiar to folks and then can expand and change to become more innovative, more interesting. And we've actually known about this developmental pattern for quite a long time. In the 1980s in the United States, we ran a project called the Apple Classrooms of Tomorrow, which some of you who study education technology are probably very familiar with. And one of the key findings was that for faculty, adopting new technologies is a developmental process. You go through a series of stages from, you know, they called them entry, adoption, adaptation, appropriation, invention. But you start just by digitizing existing practice, then by doing supplementary things, and only after typically months, years of practice, coaching, support, do you get to a point where you're doing really novel and innovative things. As you design your programs, I'd encourage you to think about how are we going to support this kind of developmental trajectory amongst our teachers? How are we going to honor their needs? Even for really innovative teachers, actually start sort of at the top of this. They get to invention faster, but lots of people start with entry and adoption. We've been doing a bunch of research practice partnerships with teacher educators where we have, say, 15 teacher educators from colleges across the United States that teach computer science. And we've been helping them incorporate our digital practice spaces in their work. And even with teacher educators, we see the same kind of developmental pattern. People get to really cool places, but they typically don't leap into appropriation and invention. They start by taking our tools and use them in the most sort of off-the-shelf, simple way possible that already kind of fits in their existing routines. And then as they can make that work, then they say to themselves, wow, this practice stuff is pretty cool. Let's start thinking about how we make bigger curriculum or programmatic changes to make things work. Maybe the last thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is some material that comes again from this free open online course we have called Launching Innovation in Schools. What is it going to look like in your institutions if you help support people through this developmental process, if you have new technologies that really start transforming teaching and learning? So this is a course that I taught with my colleague Peter Senge, who wrote a book that sold many more copies than mine has, called The Fifth Discipline, which is sort of a classic managerial text. And a big theme of launching innovation in schools is that the way to think about change is in cycles. That sort of, we often tell stories, make logic models that are kind of these linear narratives, but a lot of what you'll find improvement looks like is these continuous improvement cycles. So in this course, we talk about 4 big ideas that is a cycle: bringing people together around ideas they care about, refining a vision and getting to work, working together through ups and downs, and making progress and adjusting. Let me talk about just one sort of sub-cycle within that cycle, which I call the cycle of experiment and experience. And this is kind of what it looks like when institutions make big technology adoption initiatives and they work. And they really do end up changing the fabric of schools. There are lots of places in K-12 and higher education where people buy a bunch of technology, where a handful of individual classrooms do amazing things, and the institution as a whole is largely untouched by those investments. But as I've gone to places where there really is more systemic whole institutional change, this is what it tends to look like. The way to think about this work is to start by asking yourselves the question, who has the most impact on teacher practice? And if you interview teachers in K-12 and in higher education, there may be variations in Israel, but my guess would be this is the same, that the number one answer is other teachers. Teachers adopt new practices when they meet up with and learn from other teachers that are excited about this. If you ask who has the most influence on teacher curriculum, you actually get some different answers. The state, school leaders, institutional leaders, there are other folks that change what we teach as teachers. But if you ask teachers how they change what they teach, the number one answer is other teachers. That ends up being the kind of signature constraining fact, the most important reality for school leaders to confront when launching new technology initiatives. What you must do in some form or another is create the conditions for peer-to-peer learning, because it's only through those peer-to-peer interactions that teachers actually change. I mean, you can make people do stuff. You can force them to put a smart board in their classroom or something like that. But if you actually want their practice to change, it emerges through peer-to-peer learning. And here's kind of what that looks like. New initiatives generate fear and anxiety. That is a totally normal reaction to school leadership saying we're going to try to do things differently. Despite that fear and anxiety, in every institution, there are always faculty members who are enthusiastic about trying new things. There's going to be a small cohort of innovators, regardless of what you do in your institutions, who are really excited about experimenting and leading change with new ideas. When these experiments happen, the people associated with those experiments will learn and grow. The teachers themselves, the library and media specialist who supports it, the technology specialist who supports it, the instructional design people, and they will grow through the process of reviewing and reflecting on that experience. Ideally, then, there are opportunities for other folks other than that small group of people to share what they're learning with one another, that there's a kind of institutional learning that gets to happen. And that leads to more peers wanting to plan new initiatives. And that planning leads to new experiments. And when change happens, you see this sort of virtuous cycle where people try stuff, they reflect on what they learned, they share what they learned with their colleagues plan new experiments. And ideally, the fear diminishes over time and the growth and institutional learning expand over time. Again, crucially, my hunch is, and I haven't met all of you yet, but that many of you might not actually be the people who will be doing the heart of this work. The heart of this work is faculty leadership in peer-to-peer learning. So if you're the dean or the provost or the president or the teaching and learning center director, like where do you fit in this model? And my suggestion to you is that your job is to help the teachers who will be driving this work figure out how to make it faster, more enjoyable, more satisfying, more efficient, more rewarding, more joyful. For the most part, in most institutions, teachers don't get paid anymore, whether they're faculty members in higher education or in K-12, for getting paid any better. And so where you see really powerful learning happen is in institutions where colleagues get a great deal of personal joy and reward out of learning from one another. So one way you can think about your role in this cycle is sort of, what are the ways that you can kind of grease the wheels of this cycle from the outside? How are you going to generate an R&D budget for pedagogy? How are you going to create new time and new resources for faculty to create new ideas and implement them? How are you going to leverage the students in your institution? From middle schools, elementary schools, up through higher education. When we do technology innovation initiatives, we all too often think of students as the recipients of this initiative rather than partners in the work. And I promise you that there are lots of teacher candidates in your school who would love to help you do this work for course credit or work study funds. They're a great resource for doing this. When thinking about how to learn from new experiments, two of the most valuable common practices are peer observations, getting faculty in each other's classrooms, and looking at student work. Seeing how new initiatives actually change student writing, student teaching, student lesson planning. You should be thinking about, as institutional leaders, where in your institution are you going to create the spaces and the times for peers to learn with one another? Where will you create space for teacher-led professional learning? Where will you have teaching fairs, faculty meetings, department meetings, other spaces where people can share the innovative work that they're doing? There's a really fun unconference model that has been popular in the United States for a long time called Ed Camps, which is another way of doing teacher-led professional development. And then maybe the last thing to think about as leaders is, how are you going to put some guardrails around this work? How will you create a shared vision, a shared instructional language, so that all of this experimentation is not just 1,000 flowers blooming, but are different, is a community of faculty member kind of trying to roughly row their oars in the same direction. So hopefully this gives you some concrete, both a framework for thinking about if you all really take off and use technology to have there be systemic change in your institutions. My hunch is that it will look something like this. And for those of you who are faculty members, faculty leaders in the middle of this, I hope you see yourself in this inner circle. And for those of you who are provosts and presidents and deans and in leadership positions, I hope you see yourself and have some ideas for how you can grease these wheels from the outside. And again, there's lots more in launching innovation in schools that I hope will be helpful to you in thinking about this work. And it's all archived at the MIT Open Learning Library for you to use with your colleagues on the faculty, with your students in educational leadership programs, and those kinds of places. So hopefully in a short half hour, that gives you kind of 3 ideas to wrestle with. What is it that some innovative work might look like? And hopefully our work in online teacher learning and in teacher practice spaces gives you some ideas there. What are the obstacles that you might encounter that I think failure to disrupt will help you with, particularly thinking about the curse of the familiar and how innovation gets blocked in schools. And then hopefully some of the materials in launching innovation in schools might help you see your way past those challenges, thinking about this cycle of experiment and experience. So I'll pause there, and Gideon and Sharon can tell us what kind of time we have, and how else we should use our remaining minutes.
Yes, great. So first of all, thank you so much. That was fascinating and important, and just in time, exactly, for the Prisma members here. Personally, I took 2 takeaways here. One, dealing with the importance of peers as a critical condition for sustaining change. And I love these very small opportunities that the digital era can bring. We are out of time, so we will not have time for questions, unfortunately. So it's time to say goodbye, to thank you, Justin, for your time and for your wisdom and for being with us today. We appreciate it deeply. And thank you for all the people who joined us today. Toda rabba and happy Purim. This is recorded, so we will also distribute the recording. If there's someone who wants to ask just one last question before we say goodbye, maybe 1 minute, but not more than that. So if there's a quick question, we might squeeze it. Yes, please, Eina.
How to create a culture of innovation in academic institutions?
The shortest answer to that is that people want to be innovative around the things that they care about and that they're good at. So it's natural to want to say, well, what are all the problems with our programs? But often a great approach is to say, like, what are we really good at and what do we really care about? And where can technology and innovation not be seen as like an extra thing that we have to do, but tools and resources that help us do the things that we already believe are really important. I think in a lot of institutions, the mistake is to see technology as a technology initiative. What we really want it to be as a learning initiative around something we already care about, where these new tools accelerate that learning.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a look at the chat. You can see a few links that Justin dropped down here, probably to also for the, how is it called? Teacher moments, right?
Yep. So we host twice monthly. You can go and play around a little bit at teachermoments.mit.edu, although it's a little hard to navigate on your own. But we have these twice monthly open meetings where we help institutions figure out how to use teacher moments. And so you can email me at jreich@mit.edu or Gideon Sharon. We can keep talking about how we can set up one of those kinds of meetings for folks on your team. And then you can also find all of the online courses that we've created at the Open Learning Library, and that link that I just put in there should point you to the 5 that we have. And then if people want to see the practice spaces in the online learning, sort of in practice, right now, you and all of your faculty and all of your students are invited to join us at Becoming a More Equitable Educator, Mindsets and Practices. And we have learners from all over the world who are taking that course with us, and it would be great to have you come and join us.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Justin.
You're very welcome. Happy Purim. Good luck with your initiative.
Thank you. Bye-bye. All the best. Bye-bye. תודה רבה לכולם וחג שמח.
Thank you, Justin.
חג שמח.
תודה, חג שמח לכולם.
חג שמח ותודה על האירוע.
תודה, היה יום מקסים.
תודה לכם על היותכם נהדרים כאלה.
ממש.
ואנחנו מחכים להמשך.
כן, רק התחלנו, עכשיו זה מתחיל.
תודה רבה.
בסלון, יש לנו עוד חצי שעה סלון, רק סתם.
עם מי? עם ערן, גייסת את ערן.
סלון של הבא.
תודה לכם, כל הכבוד.
כל הכבוד, היה נפלא מאוד.
תודה רבה, חג שמח.
תודה רבה. חג שמח.
חג שמח.
פורים שמח לכולם.
תודה רבה וחג שמח.
תודה להתראות.
ביי. חג שמח.
ביי ביי.
ביי. פורים שמח וכל טוב.
היום